The senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, earlier today, the Republican Senate leader came to the floor and noted the fact that when the American people were asked about the issues of the moment, they didn't mention their right to vote. I think most Americans would be surprised that we're even debating that issue at this moment in American history. We know the right to vote has been contentious, divisive, deadly when it comes to the policies of this nation, particularly the policies of individual states. It was one of the critical reasons, in addition to the hideous institution of slavery, that we went to war among ourselves, and 600,000 plus Americans gave their lives. It really was at the heart of what happened after that. When the North prevailed, the Union was saved. The President of the United States, a man from Illinois, not only created an Emancipation Proclamation, but set the stage for constitutional amendments, which guaranteed that right to vote. So I imagine some people would be excused if they didn't list it as the highest priority. They probably assume it's really not an issue for debate, but it is. You see, in this last presidential election, we had 2 or 3 historic things occur. First, the turnout of American voters was unprecedented. That's a good thing. In a democracy, it's to be applauded, and each year we should try to improve on that outcome. The second thing, though, we'd have to put in the liability column, and that is a petulant former president who refused to even acknowledge that he lost the election, instead claims that he was abused and it was stolen from him. That fanciful lie is now making its way across America back and forth as former President Trump peddles it in every quarter. Unfortunately, some people are listening. Some 30% of American people agree with the president, the former president, that the election was stolen from him. He couldn't win that argument in any courtroom. He couldn't even convince his hand-picked attorney general to back him up. And so he resorted to sending a mob of his followers on January 6, 2021, storming this Capitol. For the first time since 1812, we were invaded by people who did not subscribe to the basic tenets of our Constitution. It was a grim day. I'll never forget it. Those who were here, I'm sure, say the same. But it set the stage for a campaign that has followed for more than a year. This morning we read in the paper that some 8 Republican attorneys general are going to close ranks in a Trump-inspired alliance to change election laws across America to his liking. Shame on them. And shame on anyone who thinks that that is what America is all about. We should encourage more and more of those legally eligible to vote. We should make it an easy exercise and not a hardship and burden. But the states, almost 20 of them now, are in the process of changing the laws in their states on voting, and with each change of the law, making it more difficult. Oh, it doesn't sound too reprehensible on the face until you add it all together. The notion that people would have less time to apply for absentee ballots, the fact that they would have to come up with a good reason, that their applications for those ballots would have to contain certain information which is new and sometimes challenging to individuals, limiting the periods of time that people can vote, limiting the opportunity to register to vote in special elections, as in the state of Georgia. Each and one of those is an additive factor to reducing the likelihood that people will turn up and vote. Even this notion in Georgia that you can't provide food and drink to voters waiting in line. Well, in my hometown of Springfield, Illinois, we vote in the Park District. There's seldom a wait more than 5 minutes, and that is about the average across America. But we know there are exceptions. We've seen people waiting in line much longer. In fact, one state found that African Americans waited in line an average of 50 minutes, not 5, 50 minutes. And the idea of perhaps giving someone a drink of water under those circumstances is now against the law in Georgia. It's hard to imagine. That's just one of the things they wanted to add to the burdens of voting in America. So when we come to the floor and discuss voting and the Republican leader tells us people don't care, I'll bet they will when they come to realize what's happening. It's interesting that he notes that what they do care about, they care about the coronavirus. I do too. I didn't have to check the voting records to know what I'm about to say is true. That senator from Kentucky and every other senator on that side of the aisle voted against Joe Biden's American Rescue Plan. In the beginning of his administration, he had a bold, policy-driven piece of legislation called the American Rescue Plan, which set out to do something that had to be done. Yes, we had found the vaccines, but in order to produce them and to administer them, we needed a program that cost money. Joe Biden stepped up and said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to get this jab, this shot available to Americans across the board, and we're going to spend the money to do it. It does no good to have a formula which can save your life, and yet you can't access it or pay for it. So he put it in the American Rescue Plan. It just made common sense, didn't it? With so many people dying and sick, that we have an ambitious, unprecedented, historic administration of that vaccine across America. Easy vote for me and for every Democrat, and obviously easy on the other side for Republicans, because not a single one, including the Republican leader from Kentucky, would support President Biden in that effort. Money in there as well to keep businesses open so that they could hire back their people, go back in business. I don't know about your state. I'm sure New Jersey's similar to Illinois, but I've talked to a lot of restaurateurs who walked up to me and said, Senator, we'd never met before, but if you hadn't voted to give me a chance to reopen this business, I wouldn't be here today. That's the reality of the bill that the Republicans every single one, voted against. So it's no surprise that they come to the floor critical of Joe Biden and his presidency and saying he just doesn't understand the real issues. Well, the coronavirus is a real issue. The president's response was a real response. Sadly, the unanimous opposition to the president by the Republican side of the aisle was also a real response. I can remember coming out of college and hearing about the Voting Rights Act being debated right here on the floor of the United States Senate. And as I've said before on the floor, and I won't belabor it, I've taken the time over the years to understand what led up to it. Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Great Migration, and all that followed from that. And my friend, and she is my friend, Carol Anderson, a professor at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, has written a book called One Man, No Vote. She flattered me and asked me to write the foreword to the book, which I gladly did, and then read it and thought what an incredible story it tells us about America and the battle to win the vote. I remember I was young and, as I mentioned, fresh out of college and law school when Dr. Martin Luther King came to the city of Chicago. I remember it well because I was in the midst of working as a young man on a political campaign, and it made all the headlines. When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. decided to walk through Marquette Park, that particular parade, that protest, drew violence from people dressed in Nazi uniforms, throwing rocks at him and jeering at those who supported his effort. I remember that because nowadays, when you talk about Dr. Martin Luther King's Day of Observance, which is coming up next week, people have a tendency to think of that in gentle and positive terms. And it should be. But let's not forget the price he paid ultimately his life, to deliver that message to a divided America. And so when we talk about why he did it and what it meant to us, one of the guiding factors was the right to vote, and his belief that from Reconstruction forward to his day, we were still finding ways to deny the right to vote to African Americans and others in this country. It was that fundamental an issue he was willing to give his life for. For some of us, Martin Luther King's Day will be a day of reflection, a chance to envision in America what it truly means to be free at last. But it's also a day of action. Let's hope we have some action here on the floor of the United States Senate. Each day we open the session of the Senate by pledging allegiance to the flag. That's a good thing. I do it out of respect, and gladly so. But we don't stand here and pledge allegiance to the filibuster. The filibuster is a Senate rule, not that long in its history, that is an interpretation of what the Senate is about. It's changed over the years, over and over again. It's not sacred. It's not constitutional dictum. It is, in fact, the best efforts of politicians in this chamber in their day to write a rule that establishes a minimum vote. And what does it mean to us? Well, it means a lot. In the Senate that's divided 50-50, 50 Republicans and 50 Democrats, it means that there are measures which require 60 votes. That used to be a rare occurrence in this body, that someone would invoke a filibuster. And yet now it's become virtually commonplace. If you just look at the last 5 or 10 years, you can see a change in the Senate, a dramatic, orchestrated change in the Senate. What was uncommon, requiring 60 votes for a measure, has now become the standard. And of course, what that means is very few things come to the floor of the Senate. When the Republicans were in control just a few years ago, during the course of an entire calendar year, on the Senate floor, we voted for 26 amendments. 26. In the normal history of the Senate, hundreds of amendments are voted in the course of a year. But because of the filibuster and the design of many to slow down and stop the business of the Senate, in 1 year, we voted for 26 amendments. 26. And that is what happens when you shut down debate. That is what happens when you shut down opportunities for amendments. And that is what happens when you pledge allegiance to the filibuster. We've got to be honest about this. There should be an exception written in for the filibuster when it comes to voting rights. Something as fundamental as our constitutional authority to vote should be given a day for argument on the floor of the Senate and should be subject to a majority vote up or down. That's not too much to ask. I'd rather pledge allegiance to the flag and to the voting authority in America that it represents than to the filibuster, a rule which has been misused as much as it's been properly used in its history. There are many enduring victories that we can attribute to Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement. But the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 65 are certainly high on the list. These laws put a stake in the heart of Jim Crow, expanding voting rights to generations of Black Americans. Prior to the passage of these laws, state legislators throughout the Deep South had disenfranchised voters of color through a whirlwind of discriminatory legislation. These laws didn't explicitly ban Black Americans from voting. The 15th Amendment, ratified during Reconstruction, prevented them from doing that. But soon enough, these lawmakers discovered new ways to discriminate against voters of color. And in decades after Reconstruction, they erected barriers to the ballot box like poll taxes, property ownership requirements, literacy tests. When it comes to Jim Crow laws, it's easy to get caught up in abstractions of generic descriptions. You hear the phrase literacy test that was used even into the 1960s in America, and you think, well, that just means I have to read at grade school level, right? Wrong. A poll test from a Louisiana parish had questions on it which I struggle to answer even today, and they were designed to make sure that voters wouldn't be able to answer them. draw a line around a number or letter of this sentence. What the heck does that mean? On and on. I share this example to demonstrate what voter suppression looked like in the days of Dr. King. In the words of historian Carol Anderson, I mentioned earlier, tactics like literacy tests were, quote, legislative evil genius. They didn't disenfranchise voters on the basis of their skin color outright, but they were only administered to some voters, and you can imagine which ones. Thank God the members of this Senate, on a bipartisan basis, decided in the 1960s to outlaw this legislative sleight of hand. Our predecessors didn't cave in to the disingenuous cries of states' rights, which we hear to this day on the Republican side of the aisle. Our predecessors understood that voting is a fundamental liberty. It should be treated differently. It is the reason we pledge allegiance to that flag, because we make the decision under that flag of who governs us. Right now, millions of American voters are facing a new wave of voter suppression laws. And much like the proponents of Jim Crow laws did in their day, Republican state lawmakers today are erecting new barriers to the ballot box. Latched onto the myth of, quote, widespread voter fraud. That's what the state legislative leaders are saying. Where could they have come up with that idea? Is it possible it's a disgruntled former president with a bruised ego because he lost his effort for re-election in 2020? The reality is, the laws they're passing in these states are not about preventing voter fraud. They're about preventing eligible Americans from voting. The nurse working back-to-back shifts on Election Day, the single parent who doesn't own a car, can't afford a babysitter, or a person living with a disability. Should we be concerned as to whether they have an opportunity to vote? We certainly should. The new laws enacted in nearly 20 states will prevent our most vulnerable neighbors from exercising their right to vote. That's why we ought to look at the Senate rules. It isn't just a matter of some theoretical academic debate on the rules. These are real-life decisions in states across the nation. And the most troubling of these laws take the assault of democracy even further. They give partisan actors more power to meddle and interfere in election administration. Some of the proposals we've seen could potentially allow partisans to overrule the valid votes of American people and anoint a victor of their own choosing. Over the next few days, I expect many of us will quote excerpts of Dr. King's most famous speeches. My hope is that we'll take heed of the words he wrote in that letter from the Birmingham jail. In it, he responded to a group of white religious leaders who'd pleaded with him and his fellow civil rights advocates to slow down, wait a little longer. Racial equality's going to follow soon. In response, Dr. King wrote, and I quote him, "For years now I've heard the word wait. This wait has almost meant never. We must come to see with the distinguished jurist of yesterday that justice too long delayed is justice denied." He continued, "We've waited for more than 340 years for our God-given and constitutional rights. I hope, sirs, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable patience." Mr. President, the issue that we're debating on voting rights and the issue of our rules is not just a casual conversation about a rule book no one hardly knows of. It's an issue that goes to the heart of our democracy, to our pledge of allegiance to the flag, not to the filibuster. The issue is our Republicans are afraid of this debate. Traditionally, they played a key role in the passage of the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s. In fact, percentage-wise, there were more Republican senators voting for that than Democratic senators. And I say that acknowledging that my Democratic Party in those days was not altogether on the right side. We've been told that we are breaking the Senate if we change this rule to protect people's right to vote. At the heart of what the Senate is and what it stands for, and the reason it exists, is the right of Americans to vote. Is it worth a carve-out? Is it worth a change? Is it worth a modification in the Senate rules to protect the right of vote? Can anything be more sacred? Mr. President, I yield the floor.